know how much to assert and how much to be agreeable and how much to adapt and how much to be, inflexible and surrender the outcome, so that your subconscious and your conscious meld together to give you a more total and complete view. We create our own version of the world based on what we are paying most attention to. We have to be very attentive and mindful, to that environment. Knowledge and insight and wisdom, these are qualities of the soul and of the universe.
Welcome to the Melanie Avalon Biohacking Podcast, where we meet the world's top experts to explore the secrets of health, mindset, longevity, and so much more. Are you ready to take charge of your existence and biohack your life? This show is for you. Please keep in mind, we're not dispensing medical advice and are not responsible for any outcomes you may experience from implementing the tactics lying herein. Are you ready? Let's do this. Welcome back to the Melanie Avalon Biohacking Podcast. Oh my goodness, friends, what a beautiful, enlightening, searing conversation I had today with Hitendra Wadhwa. Reading his book, Inner Mastery, Outer Impact, was truly a journey for the soul, and actually interviewing him just truly embodied all of that. We talk about so many incredible things in today's episode. Things like, is it selfish to focus on our own joy? What to do when you get stuck in a decision, whether you should push, pull, pause, or pivot? Why do smart people do not so smart things? How can we find our purpose? How can we forgive? We also briefly touch on something I haven't talked about on this show before, which is reincarnation. And of course, there is so much in here on leadership, which is Hitendra's specialty. I can't wait to hear what you guys think. There will be a full transcript as well as links to everything that we talked about in the show notes. Those will be at melanieavalon.com/innermastery. There will be 2 episode giveaways for this episode. One will be in my Facebook group, IF Biohackers, Intermittent Fasting plus Real Foods plus Life. Comment something you learned or something that resonated with you on the pinned post to enter to win something that I love. And then check out my Instagram, find the Friday announcement post, and again, comment there to enter to win something that I love. Also, random little teaser. I think I'm going to launch my TikTok. Teaser. Stay tuned for that. All right, without further ado, please enjoy this fabulous conversation with Hitendra Wadhwa. Hi, friends. Welcome back to the show. I am so incredibly excited about the conversation that I am about to have. So the backstory on today's conversation, I received the pitch about today's author and the book, and I just briefly looked at the title and the summary and a little bit about his work, and I was just immediately a yes. I was like, yes, this is definitely something I want to read. What's interesting is normally when I'm approaching a book, I do a little bit more research beforehand and I kind of get an idea about what the thesis is going to be or what the points are going to be. And honestly, with this one, I was like, I'm just going to dive in blind. Like, I'm just going to just start reading and see what I learn. And oh my goodness, friends, this book was amazing. So I'm here with Hitendra Wadhwa. He is a PhD professor at Columbia Business School and founder of the Mentora Institute. And his new book is called Inner Mastery, Outer Impact: How Your 5 Core Energies Hold the Key to Success. And so maybe hearing that title, you can kind of see how I didn't know which direction it was actually going to go in, because there's a lot of work around the ideas of inner success versus outer success and all these things. So when I started reading, I was thrilled to learn that it was actually a lot about leadership, which is something that has always really driven my own personal life. Like I was just thinking about this. I was always in like the leadership, in like middle school groups and all of those things, which maybe we can talk a little bit about, because Hitendra talks in the book about workshops and what people actually realistically learn and implement into their lives from that versus the type of work that he talks about in his book. But I'm meandering all over the place. In any case, the book was a beautiful collection of Hitendra's personal story, as well as what he has seen as themes and great leaders throughout history and in our world, and stories from that. And then a lot of his actual work going through these 5 core energies that we have and how you can grow them, even though one of them is actually growth, but how you can grow them and implement them in your lives and actually have practical change, hopefully for the better. So I have so many questions. Hitendra, thank you so much. Well, A, for your work, B, for your time, and for the conversation that we're about to have. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure, Melanie. Thank you for that very, very gracious introduction, and much looking forward to this time together.
It's funny. I feel like I already know you because I listened to the audiobook. So I was listening to your voice for so long. Quick question. Did you want to record the audiobook? Did they ask you to? I'm always really curious about that with the audiobooks.
Yeah, no, it's a great question because actually, see, this is my first book. It's been kind of a labor of love. I didn't push myself to write it for many years, even though a certain book agent might knock on my door a few years ago, knowing about my class at Columbia, because I really wanted to get it right. And I wanted to evolve the thinking to a point where I felt like this was the time. And when I finally reached that place, in the last couple of years and started to work on the writing, there was that sort of interest from my side that when we translate this into an audiobook, that I hope that I'd be able to record it myself. So when that moment came with the publisher, I did sort of throw my hat in the ring. They said, well, they'd have to audition me for it because they have the right to decide like who actually does the audiobook. And I respected that. And so I did go through the audition. And I mean, you're an actress, so you know about auditions. I mean, think about like the most prized theater production, movie production, TV production that you really wanted to be a part of. And when you hear back from the casting, folks that you got the part, that's how I felt in that moment. And then I came down to LA and it was quite an experience having never done, a book reading before. It's almost very meditative,
No, completely. And it's so funny. Similar story for me. They made me audition for my book and then they only let me do the intro. And then they were like, we're getting somebody else for the rest of the book. I was like, it's fine. That was my first time recording in studio as well. And it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I was like, oh, this is like a whole process. This is a lot.
Yeah. You know what the funniest experience for me was there? And since you have been on the receiving end of that audiobook, perhaps you can relate to this. So it's funny, I've been in the United States now for a little over 30 years. I came here very early in my adult life from having grown up in India. I've never really attempted to want to like completely assimilate and adapt my accent. So it is what it is, for better or worse. But along the way, it does get a little bit Americanized, right? So people in India feel like, hey, you speak a little bit, with an American accent. Of course, people here can very easily tell that Hitendra's got an accent, which probably means he learned English somewhere else. But it's interesting because there are a few words which have escaped my notice. That it was the recording kind of studio partner who I had there, who was listening to everything I was saying, who was inviting me every now and then to pause and redo that word. And I was awakening myself to the realization, oh my God, there are these like 17 words that I keep using all the time, which apparently I speak them in a way which like people must scratch their head and say like, what was that?
Oh, that's so funny. I love that. Actually, I had another question really quick about it. Okay, because I mostly listened on the audiobook. On occasion, I had the written one and I would read a little bit from that. And there was one moment, I don't know what the odds are of this, but I had just listened to the audiobook version and then I switched to the written form and I realized that what you had just shared was only in the audiobook. Did you do that a lot or was it just that one moment that I happened to capture?
Oh my God, you're going to have to like go back and jog your memory because I'm very curious to know what that is.
I will.
Yeah. I don't really recall that. The recording partner I had he was quite diligent in making sure I was hewing quite, precisely to the text. And so this would be very interesting if there was a certain moment of spontaneity where I just felt in flow and said or offered something that was a little bit of a, launching point off from the book. Yeah. So I'd be very curious.
I'll definitely find it. And you actually started it the way that you just said. You started it by saying, I'm feeling something like I'm feeling compelled to share this right now. And then you like said something. And then I just happened to flip to the written form and it wasn't in that form. And I was like, oh, I was like, maybe he like added a lot of other things that I missed. Because people will do that sometimes in the audiobooks.
I see. Yeah. I was saying it was a very meditative experience. And so maybe that was one of those moments where,
Maybe he just let you go.
yeah, exactly.
Oh my goodness, that's so amazing. I love that. Well, in any case, okay, so I love that clearly this book is a labor of love for you. So when you were forming the tenets in it, because it's kind of ironic because you actually talk early in the book about how, and I mentioned this already, but how people, will go to leadership workshops and things, and then basically there's this paradox where it's hard for them to actually integrate things into their lives from it. So my question is, how did you actually come to, your recommendations and what you lead people through? And how is that different from like a quote, normal leadership workshop?
For our listeners who are not necessarily seeing themselves in leadership positions today or in the future, I just want to sort of highlight that when we talk about leadership, right, that we are using, and you must have had past conversations with this community, Melanie, so feel free to weigh in as well. But the way I like to think about it is that it's something that life is inviting you and me and all of us to be doing all the time, right? And that is, and I explain that through this like story, for instance, in the book, which is about this father who, I know his daughter. She was a student of my class, and she mentions that when she was a teenager, she had this health issue, and they had to go to the hospital, and she was going to have a surgery in about a week's time. They had to have her under observation. And then she said, but one day into my hospital stay, the physician comes into the room and takes my father out for a private conversation. And I don't know what, they were talking about that time, except that, several years later, my father told me what actually happened. And he said that the physician took me out and he said, I have two pieces of bad news for you. One is that this surgery we have to perform on your daughter, I mean, we can't wait 1 week. We have to do it today. So we're going to have to rush into this. And secondly, we've been noticing her blood type, and unfortunately, she's not going to be able to get anesthesia for this surgery because of some sensitivities in her blood type. And so we're going to have to perform this surgery without anesthesia. And she said, I don't know that, because in that moment, all I saw was my father and him disappear from the room. But then a few minutes later, my father comes back and he is glowing, and he comes over to me and he says, daughter, I have two pieces of really good news for you. She says, yeah, what is it? And he said, well, that surgery they were going to do a week from now, they can actually do it today. So by tomorrow you'll be starting to recover, and within a few days we'll be actually back at home. So again, this will be actually ending more quickly. And secondly, they've been observing you here at the hospital over the last 24 hours, and you are the most courageous 14-year-old they've ever had at this hospital. So you know what? You're not even going to need any anesthesia. And, it'll pain a little here and there, but you'll see it'll be amazing. I mean, with your courage, they don't even think that you need any anesthesia. And she said that, of course, it wasn't easy to go through that surgery that day without anesthesia, but there was no way I was going to do anything but prove myself to be that most courageous 14-year-old at the hospital. And she said it was only a few, years later that my father actually told me what actually happened. And I share the story because, in that moment, was that father when he just heard this piece of news, and now he's grappling with his own emotions and feelings about, my God, my daughter's going to have to go through so much pain and all of that, and how do I really prepare for that, and all the. In that moment, was he living or was he leading? In some ways, wasn't he leading? And then when he goes and speaks to her, and she could have rolled her eyes and said, you're just being, this crazy dad, that I don't relate to from time to time. And, bring mom here. I kind of need to speak to somebody with more clarity and authority here than, because there's no way I'm going to do the surgery today, and that also without anesthesia. But she leaned into this, right? And she opened herself up, and she went on this hero's journey with him. So was she also in that moment, was she living or was she leading? And I offer that up because we sometimes think about these two as very separate, our professional and our personal, and our public moments and our private moments, and leading versus following and all of that. But really, if you think about leadership as being about in every moment, bringing out the, the maximum possibilities in that moment, trying to kind of sort of, have some kind of noble intent or purpose for that moment, that dinner time conversation with a friend, or that, that just happenstance interaction with a stranger somewhere, or tending to your flock in your family, or having a very public moment, of leadership in an organization you're a part of, wherever and whatever. It's an invitation from life to bring out the best in yourself and bring out the best in the people around you, in the service of that noble intent, that noble purpose, whatever it might be, right? And so when we think of it that way, then essentially it becomes very unifying, for you and for me and for all of us to be questing, right? To be questing for that, okay, what's that state that I need to engage in and walk into and activate, for myself and others, so that there's always this magic, that is unfolding between me and others. And I may be in a position of power and authority, or I may not, and that doesn't matter. But there's, if I'm showing up somewhere, I obviously have some desire or hunger or aspiration, or what is it that I want from that moment. And so, to your question about what I've seen versus what I was striving to do in this book and in my journey as a leadership trainer, one was just to open ourselves up to this almost very kind of like romantic quest, for like, oh wow, what's the best version of me? What's the best version of this person? What's the best that could arise in this situation? And what I found is that the traditional way of training people in leadership tended to be quite formulaic. There were different competencies that we organized that a leader has to master. Like you have to be, for example, mastering how to have a difficult conversation, or how to influence, or how to give feedback, or how to coach, or, et cetera, which are these official outer kind of responsibilities of managers in the world. And then for each of those, there was a curriculum. There are a series of experts. There are TED Talks and books and checklists and toolkits and masterclasses. And very quickly, for anybody really aspiring to be a good leader, it becomes quite overwhelming to have to learn and master and habituate yourselves to like these, 13,000 different things. And I realized that there is a lot of power in simplifying, in simplicity. Some of the people I most admire were people who did amazing things on the outside, but they were incredibly simple in their pursuits and discipline on the inside, like a Steve Jobs with design, or a Mother Teresa with like serving the poor, or a Gandhi with like, fighting for India's independence. They stripped things to their essence, right? And spoke and, really worked from that essence. And so I was like, okay, and what's the essence of great leadership? Essentially, what I started to more and more get drawn to is that it's not a set of competencies that you acquire from the outside, as much as it is a innate state that you activate from the inside. And that innate state, it's present in each of us. And it's really a connection with our spirit, a connection with our soul, and in some ways, a connection with the universe. When we are calm, when we are centered, when we are egoless and open and connected, with the world around us, we enter that state, and in that state, we get guided from our intuition and our own inner voice to know how much to assert and how much to be agreeable and how much to adapt and how much to be, inflexible and, whatever it is that moment might demand from us. And so that's the big shift that I've been striving to sort of operationalize and structure and support through science, and then give people like practical tools through which they can manifest the state, about sort of not feeling like you have to learn a lot of things and almost like retrofit new capacities and qualities in you from the outside, but instead just connect with something pure and beautiful and whole and wise and loving that already exists within us.
I love that so much. And now I feel like listeners can probably tell why I so enjoyed the book. That's a crazy story about the girl getting the surgery. And I remember that from the beginning. So in that situation, for example, what I'm wondering, and because you mentioned intuition, how we can know where to apply the certain mindset that you just spoke about to our life. And to expand on that a little bit more, Because like doing the surgery without anesthesia is, I mean, that sounds crazy to a lot of people. And it clearly was a great leadership moment for both of them. And it turned out well. Also, at the same time, I feel like you could apply that similar sort of thing to other situations where maybe it wouldn't turn out so well. Like, we presumably have pain for a reason, like it's telling us something, like putting our hand on a stove. Like we can't just put our hand on a stove and, be okay with that. How do we actually know intuitively what we should be doing? And just add one other little piece to it. Like later in the book, you talk about, this was so interesting to me. You talk about empathy and cognitive empathy versus emotional empathy, and how we should always have cognitive empathy, but selectively emotional empathy, because, in certain situations, it actually wouldn't benefit everybody. Yeah. So how do we know? Like, how do we know what to do and what not to do?
It's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, we want to succeed in the outer arena. And on the other hand, we want to always feel very true to ourselves. We want to feel like I was most authentic, in the way I pursued my life. And sometimes there is a disconnect between what these din of the outer voices kind of tell you, but you should do this and you should do that, and be careful about this and all of that, and yet what in some ways the purity of our inner pull is also telling us, and yet we can't sort of ignore the reality of the outer world, the risks and the rewards and everything in between. So I would offer a few thoughts, on that question. One is that in nothing that we are talking about here is there a encouragement to deny the responsibility to take an objective, rational, scientific, fact-based approach towards the things that are going on in your life. You put your hand on a hot stove, it's going to get burned. And that's just not necessarily going to be very good for you. And so there is, at this point, enough experience and science to, show that to us. And so we ought to be mindful not to be doing that unless there was some other crazy compulsion, like this lady who had to get, a surgery without anesthesia because it would have been otherwise very, life-threatening for her to get anesthesia in that moment. So yes, there is the rational, the scientific, and the logical, and we should be not in any way suppressing that capacity in us. That said, there has been a lot of research in the last about 15 years that has shown that smart people frequently end up doing dumb things. You take the 2008 mortgage meltdown crisis. Why is it that these titans of Wall Street, very, very honed, and, some of them are, folks that we've graduated from Columbia Business School. Why is it that they were struggling so much with being really forethoughtful about the kind of risks that they brought into the financial system that almost wrecked the whole national and global economy? Well, what the research is showing now is that just because you are very smart from an IQ standpoint doesn't immunize you from time to time getting very biased and distorted in your thinking, in your judgments, in your beliefs, in your decisions, because you just have a certain emotional attachment to something. So that emotional attachment to that project, to that relationship, to that sort of, particular pursuit that you're really deeply committed to for now, makes you walk into the room with a clear intent that I'm going to defend this person. I am going to make sure that we do not, shut down this project. I just need to continue down this path because I'm so attached to it, right? And then what you do is that you end up unconsciously harnessing the power of your IQ, your intelligence, to argue in favor, to harness all the facts and logic and data that you have in favor of that thing that you are drawn to. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because you're very attached to it. And so the smarter you are from an IQ standpoint, the more the research shows you run the risk that you will, in some ways, outsmart the other people in the room. Because you'll be able to think more faster on your feet, you'll be able to answer in a very compelling way, you'll be able to harness and galvanize all the facts, you'll be able to shoot your critics down. And in some ways, painfully so, right? You see that happening today. You and I, we're living in quite a divided, times, today. And people are getting very polarized. And if you look at the comments that they leave behind in social media and or in news articles, in the comments section, you see how people just basically read whatever they wish to read and draw out conclusions based on what they wish to draw out conclusions, right? Like that the dispassionate, objective, humble, open, inquiring spirit has been somewhat compromised, at today's time, right? And so that's what the research shows. That, hey, listen, be cautious. Just because there's logic and data and a intellect that you have been gifted with, doesn't mean that you will find it to be a reliable resource unless you're working a little bit on your ego and your attachments as well, right? And so this is where the intuitional capacities in you and me and all of us come in, which is that what the intuitional aspect of our being does is it obligates us, it guides us towards actually checking in a little bit on our inner state, not just on our outer activity, of decision making. And the inner state is, can you step back a little bit, from that choice that you have to make about what school should I send my son to, or, should we buy this home or not, or, should I actually have a hard conversation with this person because I don't think this relationship right now is working out for me or not, or how should I really show up in this room? How firm should I be with this person, or, etc. Right? Whatever those issues are that you and I are grappling with, what this intuitional sort of approach says is that step back from the battlefield, collect the data, make the observations, make sure you have some logical engagement, with the topic, but then step back. And when you step back, take a walk in nature, go and meet and talk about it to a completely objective, dispassionate friend or mentor who has no stake in the answer, except for just your future welfare and goodwill, or go and meditate. So just step back and make sure your emotions are calm. Make sure you are opening yourself up to listening to the whispers of the universe in whichever form they come. Because maybe they'll tell you, hey, Hitendra, this is the way you're thinking about it, but you may want to talk to that friend because they often bring very fresh perspectives. Or you remember that incident from 3 years ago? Maybe a lesson you learned there is actually quite relevant here. Or you've been thinking about it this way and only this way, but what if you also bring this thinking to focus for yourself, and maybe it'll make you change, your fuller evaluation of this, etc. So we open ourselves up to these kinds of inklings and stirrings that come from within. And when we become fully open and are not inhibiting any of these kinds of ways in which truth is trying to knock on our door to let itself in, you just never know, what that holistic, full, complete, objective perspective might emerge as. And you might end up in a place where you say, this is not what I was hoping the answer would be, or this is not what I initially thought the answer would be. But now that I've looked at everything in totality, this is the best place for me to be. And while the outcome is still something I'm trying to shape, or aspects of it are not like the ideal ones for me, this is much better than where I would have gone if I just stayed with my rational, attached, ego-driven kind of way of thinking about it. And so I encourage any or all of us, for the hard and complex and nuanced decisions in your life, to develop in ourselves that capacity to step back, open ourselves up, in a sense, surrender the outcome, so that your subconscious and your conscious meld together to give you a more total and complete view of the situation. And then for some of us, which is what I talk about in the last chapter of the book on transcendence, for some of us, we also might realize that in doing that, we are not merely contacting our subconscious and our conscious mind, but also potentially our superconscious mind, right? And our superconscious mind is where we start to connect to, in some ways, the infinite, wisdom in the universe. Just like animals and other parts of nature just are incredible in their capacity to operate with such intelligence in their domains, we may also in that way perhaps harmonize, in a sense, with whatever it is that the universe in that moment is inviting from us.
You talked in the end, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how he added on this transcendent layer at the very end that wasn't there originally, which I had no idea about. I was like, oh, nobody ever told me about that. Quick question about the intuition and everything that you just spoke about. What about people on the other side? So people who don't experience as much the impulsivity with decisions, but rather getting locked into overthinking, or, feeling like it's too much intuition and they just don't do anything. I mean, I experience this a lot, like which decision to make. So what about those people?
That's a great point. So one of the things I've sought to do is take the 5 energies, right, that you mentioned the book highlights, that any or all of us possess, and that can be the foundation of a life well lived and of success and leadership and work. Purpose, wisdom, growth, love, self-realization, right? These 5 energies. And translate, one thing I've done is translate each of them into a set of very simple, easy to understand actions. So there are actions that put like purpose out there, put love out there, put wisdom out there. So in connection with what you just asked, what about those who are struggling with being indecisive or just unconfident about like making a call on something? In my chapter called Leading with Purpose, where I took a deep dive on Abraham Lincoln and the arc of his journey and how much there is for any or all of us to learn about how to deal with the complexities of life from just the struggles that he faced. There is an action that I speak about there called push, pull, pause, or pivot. And essentially what this action is saying is that in any situation where you're grappling with like a hard decision or you're hitting against some wall, and wanting something, not getting it, you have 4 options available to you. One is to be tenacious, keep fighting the good fight and pushing forward. The other is to, just kind of step back and realize, wow, I thought this was the right thing for me to do, but along the way I got some resistance and I've learned something from that. And now I'm realizing that actually I was wrong. This is probably not the right thing to do because I'm open enough to recognize where I had some misjudgment. That's the pullback, right? Or pause, means that this is actually not the right time for me to take action. I either need to collect more data, or it very well might be that I need to let things simmer a little bit. I need to let things unfold a little bit on their own before I take any kind of, action myself. And then pivot means that I do need to act, but not in the way I was originally thinking. I'm learning enough about the situation now to realize that I'll be better off first talking to that person or taking on this alternative sort of path rather than the one I was on. And so those are the 4 choices you have. Now, what that means is that sometimes we are in error because we're pushing too hard when we should have just paused. This wasn't the right time to tell and require this person to buy into something from you. It would have been better to wait another 2 days when this person was more relaxed and they were less sort of agitated about something on their mind, and you would have had a better chance to get their buy-in about that, the thing that you're looking for. So instead of pushing, you should have paused. But the opposite is also true. Some of us might end up pausing a lot. And instead of pausing, we should have pushed because there was an opportunity. There was a window of time. So the Steven Spielberg film, Lincoln, really focuses on a special window during which the Lincoln's 4 years are kind of, essentially up, but he has been reelected now, for another 4-year term. The current Congress is a lame duck Congress because it's only going to be, in session for, one more time in these final months of their time before they get, essentially replaced by the new Congress based on the people who have been elected now. So in those about 2-3 months in that November to January, February timeframe, Lincoln had a special opportunity to really push and get a commitment from a majority, 2/3 majority of the House of Representatives to ultimately allow him to pass the constitutional amendment, to essentially banish slavery forever from American soil. And there were his advisors who were saying, Mr. President, this is going to be too hard. There are enough people here who are resistant to this, and all of that. That there's just no way we can get to a 2/3 and all of that. And, if any of you have seen the film, you'll know how Lincoln just kind of push, coaxed, cajoled, even bribed and threatened some of the House of Representatives sort of politicians in order to kind of just make sure he had enough on his plate, because he just saw this limited window of time before the next sort of, wave of politicians who had been elected came in, where these people were not as concerned about the public opinion right now. They were kind of, some of them were retiring, some of them had lost. And as they were making their way out, he just wanted to kind of get this thing, done. And so for me, having a collection of stories like this really alerts me to the realization that if you are not making a decision, if you are allowing yourself to stew over something for too long, you are making a decision, and the decision you're making is to let the present moment go. Let maybe a certain window opportunity pass you by, right? And you don't want to run that risk because there could have been things that were available to you that will not be available to you perhaps in 2 weeks' time.
Awesome. Yeah, you literally just said what I was thinking, which was, okay, so it's basically making a non-action an action. It's like it's a nice reframe, because rather than just stewing in this or wallowing in this vague sense of what to do and getting stuck there, there's like four options, and one of them is to just sit and pause for a moment. Okay, I like that. I like how like it's much more actionable and provides something you can actually do, even if it's to do nothing. You mentioned the current culture today, and how everybody it's really intense, and a lot of different opinions and things. And so I personally, like, I don't watch the news at all. I just figure that if it's important enough, it will find its way to me through whatever content I am consuming and people I'm talking to. And something I have experienced with that is because I really like, I love pursuing joy and quote happiness and all of these things. And it can feel selfish to feel that way, that maybe if you're focusing on your own joy and happiness, that now you're not caring about the rest of the world or something like that. So what are your thoughts on the whole debate about selfishness versus selflessness, and is mastering our own inner core, is that selfish?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And, you reveal very, sweet spirit, right, at your core in the desire you have for happiness and joy, and yet the sense of guilt and burden you feel about not wanting to in any way not show up, for the world as well. So let's work together on that. Yeah. So one reflection that comes to mind, I befriended this beautiful, lovely soul, Jeanette Petrie, and she had spent some time with Mother Teresa and had made a documentary film on her. So you actually see Mother Teresa live in action in that film. It's beautiful, actually, and very, very eye-opening, because you're basically in the presence of this incredible saint and change maker. One of the things that most struck me about spending those 90 minutes in that documentary with Mother Teresa is that between her and these sisters, her missionaries of charity, as they are going about their day and serving, right? These dying and the diseased and the destitute. And some of those visuals are not easy to take. I mean, you're not even in the room. You're just watching it from the comfort of your own space. But as you're watching, this work that they're doing with some of these folks who are clearly in a state of physical suffering, they were perhaps homeless and out there, abandoned on the streets, and then these missionaries came and picked them up and brought them and trying to kind of help heal them. You get struck that there are only two feelings. There are only two dominant feelings that you see flowing through the spirit of these nuns and Mother Teresa, right? In their facial expressions, in their tone, in their eyes. What do you think those two are, Melanie?
Sad,
right? One of my students went and volunteered for her, and he said, initially it was very hard for me even to see their physical state, because some of them were so just almost like near starving, right? Or they had some, wounds, on their skin and stuff like that. It was very hard for me to bandage them because it was just so hard for my eyes. So sadness or discomfort or pain, there might be love. You'd expect love because after all, these are very loving nuns, right? But you might expect the other emotion to be something like this. Well, that's not true, because
joy. Are you going to say joy?
Yes, absolutely. There was basically love and joy. That's all you see on them. Okay. And Mother Teresa once, said it to her missionaries. She said, look, these people, they don't need to see your sullen faces. They already are having a very hard life, right? The first criteria that they use to sift through the applications they get for being a missionary of charity nun, the first criteria they use is that, are you a cheerful person? Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. The second one is like, okay, do you have a service orientation, all that? Again, just to put it in her words, because she spoke in such simple yet profound ways, she said, look, you cannot give what you do not have.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So Now let's apply that to the question you raised. I have found that in today's world, there are a large number of people who are getting very stirred about the injustice they see in the world, about the oppression they see in the world. And their beautiful heart is immediately drawn to wanting to be of some service to a cause or another cause, or to fight for this or to fight for that. What I'm finding is that there is a lot of emphasis on that sort of like outer kind of work, but these same individuals are not spending much time on the inner work. And the inner work is when you show up to be of service to any cause in the world, are you showing up from a place where you are connected with your core, where you are calm, you are joyful from within, you are very centered and open, and therefore you are prepared to bring your best self. And when you do that, it has a more infectious positive impact on the people around you, so that they too start to experience more positivity, more joy. And B, you can think more clearly, you have access to more energy and resources from within you, and therefore you can last longer in that pursuit of that purpose, because you don't get burnt out or have poorer health outcomes, or just feel like depressed and feel like, I can't take this anymore. It's so hard to be a school teacher in the school. Just look at the wreckage around me and all of that. No, you are taking an hour in the morning to just connect with and nurture your own spirit within. And when you do, you developed a little bit of this armor around you, so that when you walk into these tough to serve environments, because you do deeply care for the cause of education or this social justice issue or whatever, you do deeply care, you can actually engage in those battles. I mean, imagine if there were soldiers fighting a virtuous war and they were so busy fighting that they were not spending any time really taking care of their physique, taking care of their practice, taking care of the art of warfare and other disciplines that they should engage in order to show up, physically and mentally really strong to engage in those battles, right? And so somehow we have created a world where we really honor people's visible outer acts of service without also encouraging them, or really, in a sense, almost inviting them and requiring them to come into that arena from a place of deep inner work, deep preparation, deep strength building. Yeah, just kind of like joy connection, from within. And so to me, if any of you ever feel guilty about like, how can I be in joy when, there's so much pain that my sister is going through or this community is going through, and I'm meant to be here in service of them, please remember this Mother Teresa story I've just shared with you, right? That in fact, here is this individual who gave her whole life to be in service of alleviating the pain of those the world had abandoned. But in doing that, she did not give up her capacity to stay in a state of joy. Now you might ask, how did she do that? And of course, there were these disciplines and practices that she and her, colleagues, that, missionaries of charity would engage in every morning when they would wake up early and be very prayerful and be deeply connected with, in their case, Jesus, and that immersive sort of disciplined contemplative practices that they must have sort of, acquired as part of their church.
That is so powerful. That is a beautiful reframe. I love what you said about how you can't give what you don't have. And it reminds me of something else you mentioned in the book, which was the opposite of that. If we admire certain qualities in other people, it means we have them in ourselves. I thought that was really cool. Does that mean on the flip side, some people don't have certain qualities within them and don't admire them in other people?
Well, I mean, one way to think about the flip side is that when you are getting very irritated or judgmental about certain shortcomings in other people, then in some ways, maybe it's a statement about, those same shortcomings in yourself. It's like this. The world is a place of duality. There's light and then there's darkness. And we, in some ways, create our own version of the world based on what we are paying most attention to, where we are putting energy. And there's really not a lot of distinction between the inner world and the outer world. And so the way we are showing up in the outer, like, for example, right now, to me, with some of the struggles and troubles that we are having across political and social lines in America, for instance. What this is revealing to me is more the state of unrest and restlessness and judgment that there exists within a given community, within a given family, and within a given individual, right? Because it starts from the individual. Then the next place it shows up is in the interaction of that individual with the close parties around them, their family and friends. And from there it grows into the community. And from there it becomes something which is a little bit more broader in its social thing, right? So anything you're seeing on the outside is really in some ways a mirror and a reflection of what is happening on the inside.
The last 2 shows that I recorded or interviews, we talked about this concept that you just mentioned. And there was 2 completely polar opposite opinions. On one of the guests, she studies like the animal kingdom and behavioral science and humans and animals. And so her big thesis is that today we blame society for basically everything, but it really starts in our brains, and society is not really the cause. And then the second guest I interviewed, we were talking about perfectionism, and the thesis was basically that it's coming from society, that society is the issue. So I'm super curious, even though you just touched on it, this idea that society is to blame for the way things are, or is it like, does it go full circle? Like where does it start? Inside of us or outside the issues that we're experiencing?
Yeah. It's a beautiful question. So one is the perfectionist who feels like it's the world that kind of like socializes us into thinking about ourselves that way and judging ourselves for not being perfect. And the other is like this individual who said that it's not society, it's we ourselves, right? That should take responsibility.
To clarify the second perspective a little bit, she basically says, like, our brains are wired a certain way. They're wired to seek hits of dopamine. They're wired to see hierarchies in society. This is just the way we're wired. And so we kind of project what we're wired to do onto society, and then we blame society as the problem.
There are 2 ways I can answer that question. So one is based on the frame that I mostly get when I'm having conversation like this here in the United States, right? And that frame is one where the assumption is that you and I, we are sort of like tabula rasa. When we are born, we are like a blank slate, and then things happen to us, and then there are things that we do, and gradually over time, that blank slates start to, have certain writings on it. Either that we have chosen of our own, or that the world has chosen for us through the conversations our parents had with us, and then over time, other caregivers and beyond, and all of that. So if you take that frame, then I like to really fuse opposites, which is to, rather than take a position on one end or the other of that spectrum, to recognize the importance of both, which means to always recognize that you and I, we have agency, we have choice making, and we are ultimately the authors of our own life story. And regardless of what's coming to us from the outside, that we have the choice of what attitude we bring. And once we bring the right attitude, sometimes opportunities show up and breakthroughs come, and the right subset of people from within the world starts to get drawn to our inner circle, and we form, in a sense, our own ecosystem, regardless of the state of the world, based on that, right? And then on the other hand, it's also true that we are ultimately, a function of the time and space that we live in. And we have to be very attentive and mindful, to that environment and adapt to it, and be recognizing that certain choices will come to us or be taken away from us based on the conditions and times we live in. You're living in a peaceful society, something might happen and suddenly there's a war that goes on. You can't just assume that it's still a peaceful society and keep living the old way. You have to adapt, to that environment and situation that you're thrust into. And so on the one hand, what that means is that as we adapt, it kind of looks as if our life has taken a different turn, that we are in some ways handicapped and victimized by the conditions around us or influenced by them. But it doesn't have to be if you also look at it from the vantage point of your inner life, because on the inside, you always have the opportunity to choose your attitude. You always have the opportunity to pursue your purpose. It may be that you just have to re-express that purpose in a different way from what you could, in the past. And the example I like to use of Nelson Mandela, he was an anti-apartheid, fighter for the Black community in South Africa. Then at some point he gets thrown into prison where he ends up being there for 27 years. And he said early in his prison life that he had just had to do a reset. And he said nothing was going to change. Nothing was going to change because I had to fight on the inside just in the same way as I was fighting on the outside. And he noticed within the prison system that there was discrimination against the blacks. They were only allowed to wear shorts. Whites were wearing, trousers, and they were given less calories than the whites in their food. And so he was fighting against those. And over a few years, he engaged in reform in the prison system. And then, of course, after that, he comes out and becomes this, larger than life, incredible, transformational leader to, again, keep the fight going on the outside. And so that's the fusing of opposites, which is, yes, on the one hand, we are going to be shaped by the circumstances of our time, and we are going to be influenced by, those around us. And yet, from the inside, we have the capacity to ever stay vigilant and therefore to make choice making happen on our own. Now I want to kind of throw in, with your permission, a more expansive frame, around this. Can I play with that with you for a couple of minutes?
Oh, please. Yes, please. Thank you.
The expanded frame is to think of yourself as a journeyer, in truth seeking and the pursuit of enlightenment. And that journey may in fact have begun much before you were born, perhaps even before you were conceived. I, for one, having grown up in a culture like India, where there is a belief in eternal life and in never even having been born, I don't know. It's just very hard for me to imagine that there was a finite point at which I was born. I just feel like my spirit has just always existed, and it will always exist, beyond the physical confines of my body. And when I look at it from that vantage point, and reincarnation, for instance, which I would love at some point for Western scientists to at least open up a platform of research and thinking that is founded on that assumption, right? I'm not sure why they don't, because, if I look at the numbers from Pew Research and Harris polls and others, there are a large number of people who believe in these afterlife matters and in reincarnation and things. And so I think it's a subject worthy of some, scientific study. But anyway, so coming from that frame, to me, it's like this, that you die, you get at that point to go into this, form of what you might call the astral plane. And then at some point, karmically, based on what desires and hungers and unresolved issues, etc., that you have left, still to process and learn from and, acquire more mastery over on the earthly plane. At some point, you get pulled into wanting to come back into an embodied form, into a physical form, and relive, on planet Earth and start going through the next part of your journey. And in that moment, when you get pulled back, at some level, it's a karmic pull, by your karma, and what that means is that where you are born and the circumstances and conditions in which you grow up has something to do with your past dispositions. And they also have to do with the conditions in which life believes you have the greatest chance for the next stage of the unfoldment of your growth. So you are thrust into situations that can be your greatest teachers. And the twists and turns that life takes, it takes those not merely to entertain you and to give you a smooth life, but to actually be that next class that you need to sit in and take in order to open yourself up and get a little bit closer to that fully natal, enlightened state that is your true nature.
Wow. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. And something for listeners that Hitendra does in the book is he does go through a whole conversation about science, religion, faith, the differences there, how to approach that. But it is really interesting that I haven't hardcore looked into the research, but I feel like they have studied a little bit, the idea of the soul or the consciousness being separate from the body. But yeah, they haven't really, I haven't seen any reincarnation studies. So that's really, really interesting. And also, I'm just thinking about that now. You said expansive. I'm literally feeling my mind expand because I don't want to say I've never believed in reincarnation, but I haven't taken it seriously, I guess. I haven't really thought about it much.
Yeah. It's like you just kind of like open yourself up to that, right? Sometimes you'll be in a certain relationship and you'll feel certain pulls, that come to you, or certain repulsions that will come to you. And they are so strong that it's very hard to explain them on the basis of the two interactions you had with this person in the past, in this life. But if you open yourself up to the fact that maybe, this is a soul and there's my soul, and there have been past moments where we have, crossed paths, and we may have had certain emotional or other, forms of interaction that have left something in my, in my psyche, in my karmic sort of, imprint that is starting to play up right now. So anyway, so that's just an example of how it can become a very practical guide or tool.
The really expansive part for me, and this goes back to the selfless thing and the ego. This is what I latched onto when you said that. And then I judged myself because I'm like, that's a really egotistical thought. But my first thought was, well, if that was the way it was, that would take a lot of stress out of my life, because I'm so haunted by time and like wanting to do all of these things in this short lifetime. And I'm like, wow, if that was the case, I would get rid of a lot of pressure. But then that feels selfish because I'm just making it about my own enjoyment. Again, we're going back to the joy thing.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, right? I mean, the soul is omnipresent, is omniscient, means it knows everything, and it is present in every atom in creation. And if that's the transcendental, expansive, true nature of your essence, of your spirit, obviously it cannot be if you only see yourself as this embodied being in this body at this point in time. It's hard to think about how you can be connected with every atom in creation. But if you were to actually think about yourself as consciousness, and a wave versus a particle, which we know from quantum physics is actually true of the identity of an electron, which we used to think of as a particle, but it actually can be also thought of as a wave. If that were true of you and me, then these yearnings that you're speaking about at a very human level of wanting to simultaneously be, I don't know, I'm putting words in your mouth now, but like be in 17 different experiences at the same time, and not have to give up on this in order to also get that. And in one life, be able to get, do so much. That's basically the hunger of the soul, which is boundless in its capacities, but is bounded in its physical embodiment right now.
Yes, exactly. And so, because I do feel like the soul is transcendent and the consciousness goes on. And so I think that's why I don't really have a fear of death. It's funny. Well, it's not funny. My sister, she had a really intense fear of death that she had to deal with. And I was always fascinated by that because I don't really have a fear of death, but like I said, I'm haunted. But I just feel like there's so little time and there's so much I want to do.
Well, that's beautiful. And that's special, to not fear death. You might remember in that last chapter, I speak a little bit about near-death experiences.
Yes.
Yeah. So for those of our listeners who feel like they don't yet have that, grace and capacity in them to be fearless about death in the way you've described your state, I might just encourage you to kind of study that, feel a little bit, because it's incredibly affirming. It's affirming about life, but it's also affirming about the peaceability, even the sense of joy, and the sense of, possibilities that people experience when they confront that what appears to be like the ultimate end, but could be much more than that.
Do you know Raymond Moody by chance?
Tell me more. The name is very familiar. Yeah.
Well, this is perfect timing. I'm feeling that stirring you're talking about. He really popularized the near-death experiences. He actually termed the coin in his book. He has a lot of books, but one is called Life After Life. And I think that's the first time they used, near-death experiences. He was supposed to come on the show like a few years ago, and he never actually came on. But we did quite a few phone calls, and I'm just going on a tangent, but he's just he is the most like wonderful person. And talking to him, I just feel like it lights up my soul. It's been on the back of my mind that I need to lock him down and actually get him on the show. So, okay, I'm going to, when we're done, I'm going to reach out and really dive into that. So thank you. Ooh, I'm excited. Another quick question about this idea of purpose. because you talk about three different types of people in the book. So those that, those that really feel their purpose, and then those that don't really care about purpose or don't seem to, and then those that are worried that they'll never find their purpose. So I guess two questions. The first question is, so I'm definitely in the group that's like purpose driven. Do you think we need, this is a very specific question, but do you think we need to define our purpose in specific words or terms? And the reason I ask that is because I feel so purpose driven. But if you were to ask me, what's your purpose? I don't know that I can define it. I just feel it. So how important is it to actually define our purpose?
Do you feel that you're, for the most part, making choices and pursuing things that are in concert with that sort of like that intuitive, visceral feel of purpose for you?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's around all these beautiful things that you're doing, right? In the area of health and nutrition and well-being.
Yeah. It's just learning and sharing what I've learned with other people and connecting with really wonderful people. And yeah, but it feels very vague though. I don't have language to define it. And I've thought about this quite a bit. And so then when I got to your purpose chapter, I was really excited to read it and ask you this question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you almost like just defined it for us right there, right? You talked about how it's, on certain life-affirming themes and topics, I'm sensing, joy and health and goodwill and connection are part of that, right? Wanting to kind of learn, as much about it. So part of your purpose appears to be around your own personal journey and your growth. And then part of it appears to be this one about like sharing it, right? And surrounding yourself by like kindred spirits.
It's an incessant desire to learn and share it with other people. Because when I learn stuff, I love learning. And then when I learn it, I'm like, I have to tell people. And not because I think I'm right or wrong, just because if it affects me a certain way positively, I want other people to experience that potentially, because different things work for different people.
True. And, you've spoken about how you don't like to read the news directly. So I'm sensing a lot of choicefulness in the way you engage with your, with the world around you, that you want to see in that world, the things that really help uplift people, inspire people and your own self, and then share that with the world. So it seems to me that it's already quite clear, for you, like you also said. Do you have to put it in words? For most people, it can be helpful to articulate it in words. Sometimes there's a little bit of a clarifying sort of impact it has on us, certainly for others, but sometimes even for our own self. At the same time, I don't see anything, as a requirement that you can't have purpose if you can't put it down in words. And I'll be really sort of, very, just affirmative about that way of just disabusing yourself from any such sort of feeling that you need to feel an obligation to put it in words. Because you think about it, knowledge and insight and wisdom, these are qualities of the soul and of the universe. And they have existed and operated, much before any of us developed language and started to think about these things. If you think about it, I mean, Newton's laws of motion and or Einstein's famous E is equal to mc square, to the extent these are true, they have been true even before we had any mathematics or, any other form of physics or things like that, right? And so language usually is something that is following, not necessarily preceding the core insight, right? For any and all of us, there have been probably instances where we've just felt something, and that feeling has been very, very tangible for us and very clarifying for us and very direction setting for us. But it may not have shown up as thoughts in very word-clothed forms at that time. Sometimes that transition from that feeling to seeing it clothed in certain words can be like milliseconds. So unless you're really paying attention to that inner state, you might actually start associating it with the words that it generated just through the habit of thought inside you. But what you didn't realize is actually before that thought was that instinct, that impulse, that stirring within you. There's a beautiful quote, which I don't have in the book. It's from Jonathan Ive, who was, Apple's chief designer during the Steve Jobs, like 2.0, coming back to Apple and turning it around and taking it to an incredible place of $1 trillion company. And he was the, partner of Steve in the launch of these pioneering products, like the iPod and then the iPad and the iPhone. And he says, at first, he talks about the phenomenon of creativity. And he says, at first, there is just that spark, within. And he said, and then you give it like form in words. And then it's still very fragile. And you can't really trust sharing this with lots of people. So you may just very confidentially share it with just one or two people. And then it becomes a little bit more solid and clear. And then you can prototype. And now you can take it to more people, et cetera. It's just amazing the way he describes that arc, of that creative journey. But he starts, from that point of that spark, right? And so I am cheering you on in continuing to pursue what you're pursuing, even without feeling that you have to put it in words. If you're feeling very clarified, very harmonized, very aligned about it.
Awesome. Okay, that's so helpful. And I guess I haven't really thought about it, but so what I'm doing literally right now at this moment, I'm talking to you, I'm learning from you and sharing it with, all the listeners. So I this is a very purpose-driven moment for me. And it's funny because I've always been, so growing up, and like I said, I felt this way for so long. And I would always meet people who, didn't know what they wanted to do or seemed casual about it. And I was almost a little bit envious of that state because I was like, well, that would be, again, going back to a lot less stressful. I almost envied people who didn't seem as purpose-driven because that seemed a little bit easier, because then it seemed like you wouldn't let yourself down as much if you weren't aggressively pursuing something. I've evolved my feelings about that a bit, but for those other two types of people, so people who seemingly don't care about finding a purpose, and then there's people who can't seem to find their purpose, what do you offer to them? And then just to add one last thing to it, it's interesting because presumably people listening to this show or reading your book or going to the workshops, presumably, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming most of them are looking to seek certain things. But what about that camp that just doesn't want to? Should they just live that way, I guess? Yeah. So what about the other people with purpose?
Yeah. I mean, my guess is that probably those who are not very much active in seeking purpose and they're what I call in a very cruising, phase in their life, they're probably not listening, to you and me have this conversation right now. And I respect that very much. I think, it is to each unto, their own. And, I don't feel the need to offer any advice or guidance to anybody who is not seeking it, I respect the state that they're in, at this point in the journey. And it might be at some point that they feel that hunger, at some point they feel something arising within that, been there, done that. Life just seems to be a repetition of the same cycle. I keep having the same kind of conversations at these parties I go to, et cetera. And I am looking for something else now. My soul is feeling a little bit dry, and so typically at some point, even for those individuals, there comes a moment where, and when that might be, whether it's at the age of 20 or 40 or 60, or perhaps not in this life and not in the next life, but in 3 lives from now, it's a natural state to get into ultimately, to want to ask these questions about why was I born and what's the true relationship between me and the universe, and is there in fact a sense of order and justice to things around me which otherwise seem very random, etc. So even before you find your purpose, it's quite possible that these stirrings and these questions and this curiosity arises to look at things from a place of deeper puzzlement, a sense of awe and intrigue, and and that kind of like starts to take us down a path of truth seeking, and some of us end up with the scriptures and some and preachers, and some end up with philosophy, and some just being a student of one's own life journey and starting to record learnings from one's experience. But any or all of that are just kind of like beautiful pathways that ultimately take us to a place where certain breakthroughs arise. And as they arise, what's really unique and special is that we may be taking our own pathway. We may be going down very, very different sort of, just journeys and hiking points. But we all seem to ultimately be getting closer and closer to the top of the same mountain. And when we get there, we start to actually find that we were all quite unified in the quest that we were on for eternal happiness, for eternal peace, for eternal love. Yeah. And so for those who are in a cruising stage right now, I, cheer them on and wish them well. And when the time is right for them, then hopefully they'll know where to come to, to find the calling. Now, for those who don't have the purpose right now, but want something, I like to say very simply that don't ever feel that you don't have purpose, because your purpose is to find your purpose. And that's a great purpose to have, to be on fire with these kinds of asks and questions about sort of, let me try to make more meaning out of the situations in my life and the stirrings, that I have within me, and my highs and lows, and what is it that gives me a greater sense of meaning and fulfillment from within, regardless of what the world might say from the outside, and, et cetera, right? And you start doing some of that inner tilling of your soil. And then over time, it starts to, reap rich rewards and bear fruit.
I'm the same way in that I really want people to do what they want to do. So that's another benefit of having a podcast, is I can just create the content, or like writing a book like you, and then people can, the people who want to consume it or read it or listen can. I'm not like thrusting it down anybody's throats. I think the thing I struggle with the most as far as understanding how to actually change the inner part. And for friends, I highly, highly recommend this book. We only briefly touched on everything in it. There's so much content in it. But there's one action where when I experience this, I just don't know how you literally do that. And it's so forgiveness. Like there's not like a long list of people that I feel like I can't forgive. But if there's something that happens, I can intellectually understand forgiveness, but actually like feeling it, depending on the situation, again, it's pretty rare, but still, I just don't know how you feel something you don't feel.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And look, I mean, on our human paths in life, there are at times moments and people and situations that we feel we've been treated very unfairly, about something, and perhaps somebody has even inflicted some pain. I don't know. Obviously, situations like that, Melanie, you may be grappling with or have in the past, and I respect that very much, because those are not easy. There was a situation with one individual who had, I think been really, really unfair to me in my early 20s. In that moment, we severed our relationship, and I moved on, and I wanted to quest for this capacity to forgive. Now, I do want to distinguish between outer forgiveness versus inner forgiveness. And as I say in the book, on the outside, it's not at all obvious that there is one single right answer. In some cases, we should just truly forgive on the outside and move on. It's a relationship with somebody that we love and trust, and, we're all human and we make mistakes, and this person is willing to take, responsibility over their behavior and be very contrite about it. And, why would you just keep that grudge going when the person is striving to move on? But there are other situations where you may want to, give the other person some form of a ultimatum, or sort of seek to distance yourself in that relationship, or maybe even litigate against that person in court, etc. So, I mean, I can't really claim that I know exactly what the right thing to do is on the outside in any given situation, but on the inside, inner forgiveness, that's kind of what I, was offering a certain model for, in the book. And so in my case, on the outside, I decided that I was going to continue to separate myself from this person. But what I noticed on the inside when I wanted to forgive is that I really wasn't there yet. So there would be these moments where somebody would bring that person up because they were still in a mutual circle, and all that. And so they would bring that person up. Now, I hadn't seen that person for years. But what I noticed is that if the mutual connection that we had, if this person would bring up that person in a positive way in some ways, then I would feel disappointed. And if they would bring them up in a negative way, in a gossipy way, I would actually feel happy, And I realized through that, like, wow, I haven't allowed myself from within to really make this journey where I only want to, from within, wish them well, hope for them to grow into, the best version of themselves and be ultimately over time in a state of joy, right? In a way that doesn't cause harm to anybody else. I really hadn't gotten to that point. I was still at the point where I was like, she deserves this or this or that, what have you. And it took me years, to kind of fully work that out, because this was a pretty deep sort of groove in me, or a wound in me. But I, at some point, felt that I think I'd gotten that to that place. And I remember once I encountered that person, by happenstance again in some public space. And I was talking to somebody and I just heard this voice behind me, and it was this individual's voice. And this was like 20 years later. And physically, of course, the person had changed a little bit, but the voice is so profoundly indicative of like our soul in some ways that I instantly recognized the person just by hearing the voice, and coming from behind me. And I looked around and it was this person. But in that moment we met briefly, just in that public space. And it was a beautiful commingling of spirits. And all we did in that moment was just smile warmly, check in on each other, cheer each other on for our lives, and recognize that we may or may not meet again, but we were just kind of happy that our paths had crossed once in a positive way after that severing event, from 20 years ago. And I felt so good. I felt so good about that moment, because I just felt from inside that I'd finally achieved this proof point of this inner victory. The reason why that inner victory is important is because when, as Mandela told Bill Clinton when he asked him, like, how is it that you managed to forgive your captors, having spent 27 years in prison? And Mandela said, look, if I didn't forgive them, I would still be in prison. And so the real capacity to really sort of dig into our inner soil and till it until, that those seeds of forgiveness, get to ripen within us, comes when you realize that, I want to be in joy. I want to be in peace. I want to control that capacity. I do not want others to in any way impinge on it. That is a sacred space I have, the purity of my heart. And I want to build a castle around it, where nobody can sort of penetrate through that castle and kind of get me all kind of, riled up within, because I love that state, and I want to view the world and approach everything from that state, recognizing that when I wake up in the morning and I engage with life and get out of bed, I recognize that there are going to be imperfections. I recognize that not everything is going to be always to my liking, and things will happen. And I will be a player, and I'll engage, and I'll be empowered. And along the way, I'll kind of roll with the punches, and I'll make my calls. And where I need to litigate, I'll litigate. Where I need to pull away from a relationship, I'll pull away. When I need to give it my all and continue to just forgive, I'll do that. And those will be choices I'll make from the outside. But from the inside, my space is too sacred. It's too sacred. And when I do allow myself to get emotionally all riled up and keep holding on to a certain feeling of hatefulness or grudge or judgment or dismay or betrayal, it's not the other person who's hurting me. That happened 15 years ago. It's me who's doing it to myself now, with the emotions, the memories that I'm not sort of willing to, make peace with. So that's kind of like the logic of it. But I did want to start with my personal story because even though I know that logic, that was a situation where I had to keep working on myself, and it took me many years to get there. But I did feel good, once I got there. So I'm cheering you on this, Melanie.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, it was really timely, because I was reading your book, and then kind of similar to you, this person came back into my life that I thought, from the past. And I had just read your section in the book. And so I felt, I felt the immediate reaction. I wrote down everything I wanted to say. And then a little tool I use is, if I feel like I'm doing something impulsive, I say, wait 3 days and see if I still want to do it in 3 days. And then, so 3 days later, what I came to is kind of what you just expressed. And it was partly from reading your book. I was thinking, like, regardless of the other person and how I feel about the other person, like, the actions I take right now, is that how I want to feel and be? Like, just me. Like, so is doing this the way is it the inner core that I, am trying to cultivate? So that was really helpful. Well, thank you so much. You're so wonderful. I just love your book. I cannot recommend it enough for listeners. We only, like I said, barely scratched the surface. So definitely get it. Inner Mastery, Outer Impact, How Your 5 Core Energies Hold the Key to Success. And I always end this show, just because I realize more and more each day how important mindset is, with the question of, what is something that you're grateful for?
I was looking at my daughter, just yesterday, and just feeling such an incredible sense of blessing and beauty, and just the preciousness, of life. I know she's not my daughter, she belongs to the universe. But having been somebody who was born witness, from the moment that she, came into the earth to now when she's like 21. It's just incredible, the magic of life and the unfoldment of the human spirit. And so, so I'm just grateful for creativity, creation, birth, sustenance, the journey that all of us are on, for the unfoldment of our spirit, and having my daughter be a living museum of that for me.
Well, that is so beautiful. And actually, that's perfect. Listeners, check out the book, because Hitendra shares a story about her graduation speech that really relates to this forgiveness piece. So that's a teaser for people to read it. All right. How can listeners follow your work?
Yeah, I'd welcome you to visit my personal website, which is hitendra.com. So that's HITENDRA.com. And then if you're interested in some of the offerings that my team and I have put out there, both for you as individuals as well as for organizations that you might belong to, then my institute is called mentora.institute. So mentora.institute.
Perfect. We will put links to all of that in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for your time. You are the best. I'm sending you all of the love and good wishes, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Thank you too. This is really, so enriching. So grateful.
Have a good day. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Melanie Avalon Biohacking Podcast. For more information, you can check out my book, What When Wine? Lose weight and feel great with paleo-style meals, intermittent fasting, and wine, as well as my blog, melanieavalon.com. Feel free to contact me at podcast@melanieavalon.com. And always remember, you got this.